one for the road.
It was 10:15, and Herb Tooklander was thinking of closing for the night when the man in the fancy overcoat and the white, staring face burst into Tookie's bar, which lies in the northern part of Falmouth. It was the 10th of January, just about the time most folks are learning to live comfortably with all the New Year's resolutions they broke, and there was one hell of a northeaster blowing outside. 6 inches had come down before dark, and it had been going hard and heavy since then. Twice we had seen Billy Larrabee go by high in the cab of the town plow, and the second time Tookie ran him out of beer. An act of pure charity, my mother would have called it, and God knows she put down enough of Tookie's beer in her time. Billy told him they were keeping ahead of it on the main road, but the side ones were closed and apt to stay that way until the next morning. The radio in Portland was forecasting another foot and a 40-mile-an-hour wind to pile up the drifts. There was just Tookie and me in the bar, listening to the wind howl around the eaves and watching it dance the fire around on the hearth. "Have one for the road, Booth," Tookie says. "I'm going to shut her down." He poured me one and himself one, and that's when the door cracked open and this stranger staggered in, snow up to his shoulders and in his hair, like he had rolled around in confectioner's sugar. The wind billowed a sand-fine sheet of snow in after him. "Close the door!" Tookie roars at him. "Was you born in a barn?" I never seen a man who looked that scared. He was like a horse that spent an afternoon eating fire nettles. His eyes rolled towards Tookie, and he said, "My wife, my daughter," and he collapsed on the floor in a dead faint. "Holy Joe," Tookie says. "Close the door, Booth, would you?" I went and shut it, and pushing it against the wind was something of a chore. Tookie was down on one knee, holding the fellow's head up and patting his cheeks. I got over to him and saw right off that it was nasty. His face was fiery red, but there were gray blotches here and there, and when you've lived through winters in Maine since the time Woodrow Wilson was president, as I have, you know those gray blotches mean frostbite. "Fainted," Tookie said. "Get the brandy off the back bar, will you?" I got it and came back. Tookie had opened the fellow's coat. He had come around a little. His eyes were half open, and he was muttering something too low to catch. "Pour a capful," Tookie says. "Just a cap?" I asks him. "That stuff's dynamite," Tookie says. "No sense overloading his carb." I poured out a capful and looked at Tookie. He nodded. "Straight down the hatch." I poured it down. It was a remarkable thing to watch. The man trembled all over and began to cough. His face got redder. His eyelids, which had been at half-mast, flew up like window shades. I was a bit alarmed, but Tookie only sat him up like a big baby and clapped him on the back. The man started to retch, and Tookie clapped him again. "Hold on to it," he says. "That brandy comes dear." The man coughed some more, but it was diminishing now. I got my first good look at him. City feller, all right, and from somewhere south of Boston at a glance. He was wearing kid gloves, expensive, but thin. There were probably some more of those grayish-white patches on his hands, and he would be lucky not to lose a finger or two. His coat was fancy, all right, a $300 job if I'd ever seen one. He was wearing tiny little boots that hardly came up over his ankles, and I began to wonder about his toes. "Better," he said. "All right," Tookie said. "Can you come over by the fire?" "My wife and my daughter," he said. "They're out there, in the storm." "And from the way you came in, I didn't figure they were at home watching the TV," Tookie said. "All you can tell us by the fire as easy as here on the floor. Hook on, Booth." He got to his feet, but a little groan came out of him, and his mouth twisted down in pain. I wondered about his toes again, and I wondered why God felt he had to make fools from New York City who would try driving around in southern Maine at the height of a northeast blizzard. and I wondered if his wife and his little girl were dressed any warmer than him. Well, we hiked him across to the fireplace and got him sat down in a rocker that used to be Mrs. Tookie's favorite until she passed on in '74. It was Mrs. Tookie that was responsible for most of the place, which had been written up in Down East and the Sunday Telegram, and even once in the Sunday supplement of the Boston Globe. It's really more of a public house than a bar, with its big wooden floor, pegged together rather than nailed, the maple bar, the old barn-raftered ceiling, and the monstrous big fieldstone hearth. Mrs. Tookie started to get some ideas in her head after the Down East article came out. Wanted to start calling the place Tookie's Inn or Tookie's Rest. And I admit it has a sort of colonial ring to it, but I prefer plain old Tookie's Bar. It's one thing to get uppish in the summer when the state's full of tourists. Another thing altogether in the winter when you and your neighbors have to trade together. And there had been plenty of winter nights, like this one, that Tookie and I had spent all alone together, drinking scotch and water, or just a few beers. My own Victoria passed on in '73, and Tookie's was a place to go where there were enough voices to mute the steady ticking of the death watch beetle. Even if there was just Tookie and me, it was enough. I wouldn't have felt the same about it if the place had been Tookie's Rest. It's crazy, but it's true. Well, we got this fellow in front of the fire, and he got the shakes harder than ever. He hugged onto his knees, and his teeth clattered together, and a few drops of clear mucus spilled off the end of his nose. I think he was starting to realize that another 15 minutes out there might have been enough to kill him. It's not the snow. It's the wind chill factor. It steals your heat. "Where did you go off the road?" Tookie asks him. 6 miles south of here," he said. Tookie and I stared at each other, and all of a sudden I felt cold. Cold all over. "You sure?" Tookie demanded. "You came 6 miles through the snow?" He nodded. "I checked the odometer when we came through town. I was following directions, going to see my wife's sister in Cumberland. Never been there before. We're from New Jersey." New Jersey. If there's anyone more purely foolish than a New Yorker, it's a fella from New Jersey. 6 miles? "You're sure?" Tookie demanded. "Pretty sure, yeah. I found the turnoff, but it was drifting in. It was..." Tookie grabbed him. In the shifting glow of the fire, his face looked pale and strained, older than his 66 years by 10. "You made a right turn?" "A right turn, yeah. My wife..." "Did you see a sign?" "Sign?" He looked up at Tookie blankly and wiped the end of his nose. "Of course I did. It was on my instructions. Take Jointner Avenue through Jerusalem's lot up to the 295 entrance ramp." He looked from Tookie to me and back to Tookie again. Outside, the wind whistled and howled and moaned through the eaves. "Oh, wasn't that right, mister?" "The lot," Tookie said, almost too soft to hear. "Oh, my God." "What's wrong?" the man said. His voice was rising. "Wasn't that right? I mean, the road looked drifted in, but I thought if there's a town there, the plows will be out, and then I... He just sort of tailed off. "Booth," Tookie said to me low. "Get on the phone. Get the sheriff." "Sure," this fool from New Jersey says. "That's right. What's wrong with you guys anyway? You look like you saw a ghost." Tookie said, "No ghosts in the lot, mister." "Did you tell them to stay in the car?" "Sure I did," he said, sounding injured. "I'm not crazy." "Well, you couldn't have proved it by me." What's your name?" I asked him. For the sheriff." "Lumley," he says. "Gerard Lumley." He started in with Tookie again, and I went across to the telephone. I picked it up and heard nothing but dead silence. I hit the cutoff buttons a couple of times. Still nothing. I came back. Tookie had poured Gerard Lumley another tot of brandy, and this one was going down him a lot smoother. "Was he out?" Tookie asked. "Phone's dead." "Hot damn," Tookie says, and we look at each other. Outside, the wind gusted up, throwing snow against the windows. Lumley looked from Tookie to me and back again. "Well, haven't either of you got a car?" he asked. The anxiety was back in his voice. "They've got to run the engine to run the heater. I only had a quarter of a tank of gas, and it took me an hour and a half to... Look, would you answer me?" He stood up and grabbed Tookie's shirt. "Mister," Tookie says, "I think your hand just run away from your brains there." Lumley looked at his hand, at Tookie, and then dropped it. "Maine," he hissed. He made it sound like a dirty word about somebody's mother. "All right," he said. "Where's the nearest gas station? They must have a tow truck." "Nearest gas station is in Falmouth Center," I said. "That's 3 miles down the road from here." "Thanks," he said, a bit sarcastic, and headed for the door, buttoning his coat. "Won't be open, though," I added. He turned back slowly and looked at us. "What are you talking about, old man?" "He's trying to tell you that the station in the center belongs to Billy Larrabee, and Billy's out driving the plow, you damn fool," Tookie says patiently. "Now why don't you come back here and sit down before you bust a gut?" He came back, looking dazed and frightened. "Are you telling me you can't, that there isn't—" "I ain't telling you nothing," Tookie says. "You're doing all the telling, and if you stop for a minute, we could think this over." "What's this town, Jerusalem's Lot?" he asked. "Why was the road drifted in, and no lights on anywhere?" I said, "Jerusalem's Lot burned out 2 years back." "And they never rebuilt?" He looked like he didn't believe it. "It appears that way," I said, and looked at Tookie. "What are we going to do about this?" "Can't leave them out there," he said. I got closer to him. Lumley had wandered away to look out the window into the snowy night. "What if they've been got at?" I asked. "That may be," he said, "but we don't know for sure. I've got my Bible on the shelf. You still wear your Pope's medal?" I pulled the crucifix out of my shirt and showed him. I was born and raised Congregational, but most folks who live around the lot wear something. Crucifix, St. Christopher's medal, rosary, something. Because 2 years ago, in the span of one dark October month, the lot went bad. Sometimes, late at night, when there were just a few regulars drawn up around Tookie's fire, people would talk it over. Well, talk around it is more like the truth. You see, people in the lot started to disappear. First a few, then a few more, then a whole slew. The schools closed. The town stood empty for most a year. Oh, a few people moved in, mostly damn fools from out of state like this fine specimen here, drawn by the low property values, I suppose. But they didn't last. A lot of them moved out a month or two after they'd moved in. The others, well, they disappeared. Then the town burned flat. It was at the end of a long, dry fall. They figure it started up by the Marston house on the hill that overlooked Jointner Avenue, but no one knows how it started, not to this day. It burned out of control for 3 days. After that, for a time, things were better. And then they started again. I only heard the word vampires mentioned once. A crazy pulp truck driver named Richie Messina from over Freeport way was in Tookie's that night, pretty well liquored up. Jesus Christ, this stampeder roars, standing up about 9 feet tall in his wool pants and his plaid shirt and his leather-topped boots. Are you all so damn afraid to say it out? Vampires! That's what you're all thinking, ain't it? Jesus jumped up Christ in a chariot-driven sidecar, just like a bunch of kids scared of the movies. You know what there is down there in Salem's Lot? Want me to tell you? Want me to tell you? Do tell, Richie, Tookie says. It had got real quiet in the bar. You could hear the fire popping, and outside the soft drift of November rain coming down in the dark. You got the floor. What you got over there is your basic wild dog pack, Richie Messina tells us. That's what you got. That and a lot of old women who love a good spook story. Why, for $80, I'd go up there and spend the night in what's left of that haunted house you're all so worried about. Well, what about? Anybody want to put it up? But nobody would. Richie was a loudmouth and a mean drunk, and no one was going to shed any tears at his wake. But none of us were willing to see him go into Salem's Lot after dark. They screwed the bunch of you, Richie says. I got my 410 in the trunk of my Chevy, and that'll stop anything in Falmouth, Cumberland, or Jerusalem's Lot. And that's where I'm going. He slammed out of the bar, and no one said a word for a while. Then Lamont Henry says, real quiet, that's the last time anyone's going to see Richie Messina, holy God. And Lamont, raised to be a Methodist from his mother's knee, crossed himself. He'll sober off and change his mind, Tookie said, but he sounded uneasy. He'll be back by closing time, making out it was all a joke. But Lamont had the right of that one, because no one ever saw Richie again. His wife told the state cop she'd thought he'd gone to Florida to be the collection agency, but you could see the truth of the thing in her eyes. Sick, scared eyes. Not long after, she moved away to Rhode Island. Maybe she thought Richie was going to come after her some dark night, and I'm not the man to say he might not have done. Now, Tookie was looking at me, and I was looking at Tookie as I stuffed my crucifix back into my shirt. I never felt so old or so scared in my life. Tookie said again, we can't just leave them out there, Booth. Yeah, I know. We looked at each other for a long moment. Then he reached out and gripped my shoulder. You're a good man, Booth. That was enough to buck me up some. It seems like when you pass 70, people start forgetting that you are a man or that you ever were. Tookie walked over to Lumley and said, I've got a 4-wheel drive Scout. I'll get it out. For God's sake, man, why didn't you say so before? He had whirled around from the window and was staring angrily at Tookie. Why'd you have to spend 10 minutes beating around the bush? Tookie said very softly, Mister, you shut your jaw. And if you get urged to open it, you remember who made that turn onto an unplowed road in the middle of a goddamn blizzard. He started to say something and then shut his mouth. Thick color had risen up in his cheeks. Tookie went out to get his Scout out of the garage. I felt around under the bar for his chrome flask and filled it full of brandy. Figured we might need it before this night was over. Maine blizzard. Ever been out in one? The snow comes flying so thick and fine that it looks like sand and sounds like that beating on the sides of your car or pickup. You don't want to use your high beams because they reflect off the snow and you can't see 10 feet in front of you. With the low beams on, you can see maybe 15 feet. But I can live with the snow. It's the wind I don't like, when it picks up and begins to howl, driving the snow into 100 weird flying shapes and sounding like all the hate and pain and fear in the world. There's death in the throat of a snowstorm wind, white death, and maybe something beyond death. That's no sound to hear when you're tucked up all cozy in your bed with the shutters bolted and the doors locked. It's that much worse when you're driving. And we were driving smack into Salem's lot. "Hurry up a little, can't you?" Lumley asked. I said, for a man who came in half frozen, you're in one hell of a hurry to end up walking again. He gave me a resentful, baffled look and didn't say anything else. We were moving up the highway at a steady 25 miles an hour. It was hard to believe that Billy Larrabee had just plowed this stretch an hour ago. Another 2 inches had covered it, and it was drifted in. The strongest gusts of wind rocked the Scout on her springs. The headlights showed a swirling white nothing up ahead of us. We hadn't met a single car. About 10 minutes later, Lumley gasps, "Hey, what's that?" He was pointing out of my side of the car. I'd been looking dead ahead. I turned, but was a shade too late. I thought I could see some sort of slumped form fading back from the car, back into the snow, but that could have been imagination. What was it, a deer?" I asked. I guess so," he says, sounding shaky. "But its eyes, they look red." He looked at me. "Is that how a deer's eyes look at night?" He sounded almost as if he were pleading. "They can look like anything," I says, thinking that might be true. But I've seen a lot of deer at night from a lot of cars and never saw any set of eyes reflect back red. Tookie didn't say anything.